Next, we have from cyber villains to zero trust, layers building resilience step by step. And this is with Amy Yee. She is a CDTO and CDO, board member and advisor, engineer and podcaster, and frankly, one of the cool speakers I just met this year. And I think we're going to see more of her as we go through some of these virtual conferences into next year. So welcome, Amy. It's wonderful to have you back on the program today. The floor is yours. I'm going to let you go, and then I'm going to ask you a few questions about zero trust on the other side.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Tom, for having me. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. So the title, as Tom said, is about Zero Trust Roadmap for Financial Services. But really what we're here to talk about today is the reality that the systems we all rely on every day, the payments that move markets, the banks that safeguard deposits, the platforms that process trades are squarely in the crosshairs of cyber adversaries. So what is it that we can practically do that? It's not meant to be a theoretical talk. It's meant to really show how zero trust can effectively counter a lot of the threats that we're looking at today, but while not being a silver bullet. When we hear the phrase critical infrastructure, many people picture energy grids or water utilities, but regulators worldwide, from CISA in the US to OSFI and the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity here in Canada, through DORA in the EU, are clear. Financial services is just as critical as power or healthcare. If payments stall or confidence in the banking system erodes, the ripple effects spread instantly across every other sector. I know that many of you in this room live that reality from different perspectives. Some of you are in IT, some in risk and compliance, some in fraud or operations, and you bring different vantage points. But you all share responsibility for keeping the financial system safe, reliable, and trusted. And you also know how hard that is with siloed teams, legacy technology, and attackers who don't respect our boundaries. What I want to do today is two things. First of all, to frame the challenge in a way that connects across those silos to show why we can't afford to treat cyber fraud or compliance in isolation. And second, to walk through a practical zero trust roadmap step by step. And I'm going to keep it to 5 steps. We can have a million steps, but let's keep it to 5 that you can take back to your organizations as a way to sequence action, prioritize what matters, and build resilience against the adversaries we're all dealing with. And you probably have some of this in place today, but maybe it's a matter of refreshing what that looks like or finding a spot, to take the next step from. As most of you know, zero trust isn't new. We've been talking about it for years. But what is new is the urgency in financial services. The attacks are louder, more global, and more systemic than ever before. We're facing real villains, which is why I've got this image of like the guy with the wings and the horns, at the top of the screen here. We've got state actors, ransomware crews, fraud syndicates, and opportunists who look for our weakest links. And there seem to be more and more all the time. But the point isn't to scare you, it's to show how zero trust gives us a structured approach, a clear sequence of steps that work in the messy, legacy-heavy, interconnected world of financial services. And it's converging, and we'll talk about that a little bit as well. One third thing that's really important that I want to do today, and this is very much from my perspective of having led transformation for years, it's important to grease the wheels for action. What do I mean by that? By the time we're done, you're going to see, not just how to connect the dots between the threats we face and the practical steps you can take, but also I hope you get some ideas for how to communicate this with others, storytelling, ways to frame things so that others understand, both across the organization, into some of these silos that we're going to talk about, as well as, up and down, because it's only then that change can happen. You, as well-intentioned as you might be, and as much training as you can have, and as much practice as you can have, are not set up for success unless you're able to tell that story to other people and connect those dots for other people and help them to see what mindset is needed to move forward. All stakeholders need to see that zero trust is not a buzzword or a product, but as I said, a mindset, one that helps us to think clearly about how financial services can be resilient in a world where the threats are already inside the walls. So a little bit about me. For nearly a decade, I've had accountability for all digital and technology systems within a healthcare service organization, multiple healthcare service organizations, actually. So CDTO for me is Chief Digital Transformation Officer, which means I was brought in to help pull everything together for a change to take the next step. At other organizations, I'm a Chief Digital Officer, which also means taking accountability for all of the digital and technology kind of operations, including responsibility for cybersecurity and for developing the strategy from a board perspective, which is something that I've done, as well as I've led organizations through their first incident from an executive perspective and helped to lay the foundations for a cybersecurity program and what that roadmap looks like, for the future in a way that really works together with the business. I've built platforms and products and enabled transformation of entire businesses. Today, I pursue my passion of helping organizations, particularly those who have societal impact in critical sectors, for example, like infrastructure, healthcare, government, and defense, by empowering teams and communities with knowledge that they might not always otherwise have access to and practices, from people who are actually in the field working through my podcast, Wired for Change. I'd encourage you to, if you're on YouTube, to check it out on YouTube at Wired for Change, or follow me on LinkedIn, or check it out wherever you listen to podcasts. We do have a lot of cybersecurity content, but it's unsiloed. So you'll have cyber content next to change leadership content, next to information about architecture, for example. I also speak to you today as a Chief Digital Transformation Officer at C3SA, which is a company that's had over 20 years of experience rooted in national security and critical infrastructure. C3SA brings deep expertise in proactive, offensive, defensive, and responsive cyber operation, supporting readiness, resilience, and regulatory alignment, as well as Chief Digital Officer at Relevantz, which is a technology solutions and engineering company with over 1,300 engineers around the world. As a former client of both of these firms, I knew I wanted to work with the best of the best to help drive change. Okay, so that's a little bit about me and the lens that I bring. Okay, let's get into it. This is our cover page moment. The breach already unfolding, alarms blaring, staff overwhelmed, and adversaries demanding control. Again, we're not here to pretend that there's a silver bullet that fixes everything, but what we do want to do is walk through a practical roadmap, 5 critical steps that financial services organizations can take to move from today's fragmented defenses to a more resilient posture. So some kind of blueprint for sequencing action. And it's complicated because there's a lot of different guidance and regulations out there, but we've built this roadmap based on those regulations, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a few more slides. But it's going to be about how to start, how to prioritize, and how to build that resilience. And we'll meet some villains who thrive on our current weaknesses and show how zero trust domains help to shut them down. By the end, you'll see that zero trust can help to systematically connect identity, segmentation, monitoring, and governance to the real threats that our sector faces, so that when they make a comic book of your life, this isn't the cover. Crisis scene doesn't have to be our reality. So a little bit before we dive into the roadmap, let's set the scene so that we're all on the same page. These are the big threat trends that are growing in financial services right now. And what stands out isn't just the variety, fraud, ransomware, DDoS, supply chain, deepfakes, it's the scale. So we've got variety and we've got scale. The financial system is a global dependency, which means, of course, as you know, when one node falters, the rippling effects hit everyone. That's why sequencing zero trust steps matters. It's about building resilience against this exact wave of threats and, the threats as much as we can see them coming in the future. Under supply chain attacks, we've learned the hard way that a single supplier outage can ripple through financial systems. Think MoveIt, Snowflake, or even Polyfill. These shared dependencies create systemic risk. Under fraud, we're seeing fraud industrialized through scam compounds and fraud as a surface. No longer a lone scammer, but entire operations running like call centers. Ransomware is still one of the biggest disruptors, but increasingly targeting not just data, but operational paralysis. In other words, freezing payment systems, for example, and critical business services. DDoS, we've got lots of examples of that right now. Groups like KillNet have shown how politically motivated DDoS campaigns can hammer banks, exchanges, and government payment systems, payment platforms in waves. Under emerging tech risks, we've got deepfakes and AI-enabled social engineering. The manipulation is being supercharged. Attackers can clone voices or spin up convincing personas to bypass verification and trick staff or customers. Geopolitical threat activity, nation and state operations, campaigns like Volt Typhoon show how adversaries quietly preposition in critical infrastructure, including financial networks, waiting for the moment where they want to cause a disruption or exert pressure. And so if you put all of this together, it's not just noise in the system. These are structural global threats that force us to think differently. And that's where zero trust comes in. If we step back a bit and look at the last decade, financial services have been tested again and again. In 2016, the Bangladesh bank SWIFT heist showed how attackers could infiltrate core payment systems and nearly walk away with $1 billion. They didn't, but it could have been. In 2020, the SolarWinds supply chain attack demonstrated how upstream compromises can cascade across critical sectors. In 2021, even the Reserve Bank of New Zealand wasn't immune with sensitive data stolen in a major breach. In 2022 and 23, Killnet's DDoS campaigns hammered banks across Europe and North America, not subtle and highly disruptive. And in 2023 and 2024, campaigns like Volt Typhoon and Salt Typhoon revealed how nation states preposition inside critical networks, often quietly for potential disruption later, as I mentioned. And now with FS ISAC's 2025 report, the picture is clear. Financial services are not bystanders, we're on the front lines, and the attacks we face ripple far beyond a single bank or payment processor. This is systemic risk. So that was, a bit of a recap of the last decade. And now we get to 2024. 2024 stands apart, and it wasn't just another busy year. It was an inflection point. We saw supply chain risks from NPM and compromises to the excess utils backdoor. We saw credentials and data theft at scale, with the Snowflake breach hitting up to 165 customer environments. We saw concentration risks with a faulty CrowdStrike update causing the largest IT outage in history, and a Microsoft DDoS outage taking down Office and Azure for hours. We saw nation-state prepositioning with the US Treasury breached via vendor attributed to PRC state-sponsored actors, and we saw direct attacks on FS with Swiss banks targeted in DDoS extortion campaigns and groups like Scattered Spider probing financial institutions directly. And so the lesson here is that the threats are converging, as I mentioned in the beginning. Fraud, ransomware, DDoS, supply chain, and state actors are all hitting financial services in the same year, and these risks are systemic. When one node falters, the ripple effects are global. So that raises the question of how do governments and regulators expect us to respond? Increasingly, the answer is clear. Zero trust is becoming the policy baseline. So around the world, governments aren't just watching, they're legislating or trying to legislate, and policies converging. In Canada, Bill C-8 would bring new obligations to banks to build cyber programs and report incidents. It's not law yet, but it's on its way. In Europe, NIS2 raises the bar across sectors, while DORA zeroes in on financial services with resilience testing and vendor oversight, effective January 2025, earlier this year. And in the US, federal mandates have made zero trust the default model, shaping how FS regulators think. The bottom line, zero trust has shifted from best practice to regulatory expectation, which is so important for financial services. So, the good news, financial services is relatively mature compared to other sectors because banks and large financial services institutions have historically invested heavily in cybersecurity. We've got regulatory pressure, the need to maintain brand trust, for instance. They run generally regular pen tests, red teaming, and resilience exercises, and many are FS ISAC members. They have dedicated CISOs, security budgets, and compliance regimes. The not so good news is that systemic challenges are significant and not zero trust complete, which is why this is such a problem. Acknowledging that zero trust is not a single standard but a journey, financial services may have pieces of it, like strong identity access management, MFA, privileged access management, microsegmentation in data centers, but not an end-to-end model. And cloud and API sprawl continues to grow, often faster than we can secure it, or faster than we can layer on it. Regulators call out third-party concentration risk as systemic. Regulatory reports note inconsistent adoption across identity, device, and workload domains. And so another challenge is that mainframes and legacy protocols don't fit neatly into modern architectures. Legacy systems still underpin trillions of dollars in transactions, and they don't fit neatly into modern zero trust controls. And the threat environment is relentless. FSISEC and Akamai report that our sector is now the top global target for DDoS attacks. So while financial services has had a head start, the challenges of implementing zero trust at scale remain very real. So financial services faces a unique combination of technical and systemic challenges. And on this slide, I've shown 6 of these systemic challenges. We already talked about legacy. The thing about cloud and API sprawl in financial services, as most of you probably know, fintech integrations create blind spots. Cloud and API sprawl from fintech integrations combined with legacy core systems create fertile ground for attackers. So it's that combination of cloud and API sprawl and legacy systems that underpin everything. We know that third-party risk is a top risk. Heavy reliance on MSPs, vendors, and cloud providers creates concentration risk. Market stress amplifies risk, so we know that cyber shocks hit harder in volatile times or times when things are changing quite a lot. So with Bangladesh, we saw that it was in the midst of transforming, but wasn't able to keep up with security necessarily. And so the push for digital innovation, where you've got mobile apps, instant payments, blockchain pilots, whatever it is, often outpaces the ability to secure, leading to tension between business speed and zero trust rigor, or I would say feeding on an existing tension. Threat landscape continues to expand in sophistication and, of course, the cultural and organizational silos. So more so, perhaps, than with other critical infrastructure organizations, which goes back to a talk that I gave a few weeks ago. There are even more silos in financial services typically. And then there are also biases, like a current mindset that is focused more on prevention bias, the focus still skewing to stopping attacks as opposed to operating through them predominates in financial services. So what do we mean by zero trust? So what are the principles of zero trust? Different organizations describe zero trust in different ways. So depending on what document or organization you're following, it may look a little different, which is part of the challenge of knowing what to do with respect to zero trust and having that roadmap clear. NIST and CISA use 5 pillars. Industry frameworks tend to use 3 to 6 domains. For this session, I've expanded those into 10 practical domains. And the reason for that is so that we can map them directly to the challenges and attack paths we see in financial services, while also speaking to the language of regulators and boards. It's the same zero trust principles, just structured in a way that makes them actionable in this context. So that's probably the engineering me wanting to map, A to B very clearly so that everyone is clear on the why, and then you can test and ensure that that impact is there and continue to iterate and test. Zero trust isn't the only path, but it's a useful model because it gives us a way to think systematically about identity, segmentation, monitoring, and resilience. On the screen, you see the 10 domains, and these are the areas that together form a defense in-depth model for financial services. So starting with number 1, we've got identity verification and access control. Always confirming who is requesting access, whether it's an employee, customer, or partner. Next is device trust and health validation, making sure the endpoints we allow, from trading workstations to mobile banking apps, are healthy and secure. Then we move to network segmentation and microsegmentation, limiting lateral movement so an intruder can't hop across systems, which they pretty much always want to do. Application access controls focus on which apps, APIs, and fintech connectors are actually allowed to talk to our systems. And at the heart of it is data classification and protection, everyone's favorite subject, because not all data is equal, and client PII or payment instructions need stronger safeguards under strict compliance regimes. The other side of the slide, so the second half of the model, is about detection and resilience. Continuous monitoring and analytics help us catch anomalies in both cyber events and financial transactions in real time. Threat intelligence integration, especially through FSISEC, means that we don't defend alone, which is important. Incident response and containment is about assuming breach and keeping financial operations running. And then we look outward. Third-party and supply chain risk management acknowledges that vendors, SaaS providers, and even shared financial market infrastructure are part of our attack surface. Finally, maturity and continuous improvement reminds us that zero trust isn't a project, it's a journey. Regulators don't just want compliance today, they expect to see continuous improvement tomorrow. So those are the principles that we'll be working with for the Zero Trust Roadmap. Now, before we get to that roadmap, I always like to understand what something is, but also what it is not. So a few times I've mentioned that it's not a silver bullet, right? And there are lots of other areas that give us powerful board-level ways to think about digital risk, especially in financial services, from identity and data to APIs and third parties. We shouldn't pretend that zero trust covers the entire resilience mandate. Market continuity, fraud, and operational resilience bring in controls outside the zero trust playbook. The strength comes when we see zero trust as part of a layered systemic approach to safeguarding both trust and stability. So most of the digital-facing financial services stack is a sweet spot for zero trust: customer channels, trading systems, cloud adoption, and interbank connectivity. Unlike CI and ICS, financial services doesn't run turbines or chlorine valves typically, but there are still domains where zero trust isn't the whole answer. So when we look at the slide, we've got, on the left-hand side where zero trust is the best framing, and on the right-hand side is where other framing works best. And that's where I'll focus just in terms of my next minute or so. In financial market infrastructure resilience, FMI resilience, clearinghouses, payment rails, and settlement systems have strong redundancy, failover, and systemic continuity controls that aren't really captured by zero trust framing. If you think of SWIFT's CSP program or the Bank of England's operational resilience mandates, those are good examples. Fraud and conduct risk, controls like transaction monitoring, KYC, AML compliance, and fraud detection are orthogonal to zero trust. They complement it, but they come from financial risk management disciplines rather than cybersecurity. Physical and operational risks. So ATM networks, branch infrastructure, and card processing facilities are governed by physical security, business continuity planning, BCP, and regulatory capital requirements. Again, not directly zero trust. And then I should also mention regulatory and systemic oversight. Financial services risk regulators like OCC, Fed, IMF, OSFI impose governance and systemic resilience framework that operates on top of, above technical domains. And so those are more about operational resilience and systemic confidence typically than never trust, always verify. So in these areas, zero trust is supporting. It's not a conflict, it's just not the primary framing. And that's important to know. So where do we start? One of the key points I've mentioned before, and I want to emphasize again, is that we're not inventing something new. We're not reinventing the wheel here or off on our own path. This roadmap is built directly by pulling the best guidance that financial services regulators and the cybersecurity community already recognize, but pulling it into a way that is hopefully memorable and actionable. On the sector-specific side, we have the FFIEC CAT, our cybersecurity assessment tool, which many of you already know from regulatory exams, is grounded in NIST CSF and gives financial institutions a way to measure maturity. We also have FS ISAC threat intelligence, which I've mentioned a couple of times, which brings the lived experience of what adversaries are actually doing in our sector. And of course, regulators themselves, OCC, Fed, Treasury in the US, OSFI here in Canada, are publishing advisories and guidelines that consistently point us towards stronger operational resilience. On the framework side, we're anchored in this Cybersecurity Framework 2, which provides a globally recognized structure for managing cyber risk, and ISO 27001, which is the international bank benchmark for, sorry, not bank benchmark, it's the international benchmark for information security management. Together, they give us the governance language that boards and regulators expect. Then there's the zero trust specific guidance. So NIST SP 800-207, which defines the principles, and CISA Zero Trust Maturity Model version 2, which translates those principles into measurable stages of adoption. These give us the architecture and the maturity lens. Finally, we've pulled in the operational resources that make this practical. MITRE ATT&CK to map how adversaries behave, and MITRE DEFEND to show the countermeasures and CISA's known exploited vulnerabilities catalog to help us prioritize patching against what attackers are actually using in the wild. So it gets really granular at that point. So we've got, the 50,000-foot view, and then we've got some things that will help us on a day-to-day basis in terms of being really specific and granular, as much so as we can get. So, drum roll, please. Step 1 is governance, risk alignment, and incident preparedness. Why? Because regulators like the FFIEC, OCC, and OSFI expect governance first, and boards need real-time visibility into resilience. Traditional playbooks exist, but they're siloed and often built for a perimeter world. So how do we do it? We build integrated playbooks that show how zero trust controls limit blast radius. Stand up a cross-domain steering function across IT, cyber, fraud, and business leaders. And that's not a completely exhaustive list. Translate progress into regulatory ready metrics mapped to a NIST CSF2, and move from annual tabletops to continuous exercises with automation and adversary simulation. I also always love to do a from to when there's a change involved. It's always helpful to look at, well, what are we moving from and to? And the shift here is from compliance-driven playbooks, siloed governance, and after the fact reporting, to integrated governance, zero trust aligned incident response, and real-time regulator-ready assurance. So that's why I've got the silos listed there. For example, consider a trading desk account compromise. In a siloed world, security investigates a login anomaly, fraud chases suspicious trades, and compliance only learns when regulators call. In an integrated zero trust playbook, identity, trading activity, and data movement are linked in one incident flow. The account is frozen, regulators are notified, and the board dashboard updates in real time. That's resilience in practice. So how does that actually counter a threat? And so this is where you can start to see the villain personas that we've created. So usually, if you're familiar at all with user experience design, you create a persona to represent behaviors around a persona or a character or a user of a system, so that you can design a system to ensure easy flow, ease of access to information. And so for these exercises, I've kind of turned that around to identify a persona where we actually want to stop them as opposed to make it easy for them. We don't want them to get the information. We don't want them to be able to complete their flow, their desired flow, for instance. And so I've personified them as different villains. This first villain I've called the extortionist. And so they've got, a type, goal, personality, and entry points kind of listed on the slide, their typical attack path, and then what are the countermeasures. And so if I go back to step 1, why start with governance and incident preparedness? It's because when ransomware hits, speed and coordination are everything. Without integrated playbooks and communication strategies, financial services organizations lose precious hours figuring out who owns what, and regulators get inconsistent answers. And so that's where the extortionist thrives. They don't hide. They want chaos. Their attack path is simple but brutal. Break in through phishing or remote access, move laterally, encrypt critical systems, and then extort while teams are still debating who to call first or figuring out who might be on vacation and who to call next. Zero Trust counters this by enforcing integrated response, cross-team playbooks, regulator-ready communications, and incident containment tied to identity segmentation and IR domains. We've seen this in the real world, so this isn't a fictional kind of made-up thing, as many of you might know. We've seen this in the 2021 CNA financial ransomware attack, which crippled operations, and Colonial Pipeline highlighted how ransomware can become a systemic crisis. In both these cases, delays in coordination amplified the impact. The lesson: governance isn't just paperwork, it's your first defense against extortion. Step 2 is mapping risk to a defensible architecture. Why? Because attackers don't think abstractly. They target payment rails, SWIFT, and trading systems. Flat networks and trusted zones make their work easy. Regulators, meanwhile, expect risk to architecture mapping as proof of operational resilience. So how do we do this? We identify the crown jewels like payments and settlement, apply segmentation, identity, and data protections around them, validate the architecture using FS, ISAC, threat intelligence, and MITRE attack tactics, and strengthen it with defensive techniques from MITRE Defend, such as network segmentation, credential hardening, and data tokenization. Finally, document that defensible architecture in regulatory friendly terms. So the from to, the shift is from firewall level diagrams and audit driven risk maps to adversary informed, segmented architectures that align to business criticality. The image of water management here reminds me of the Netherlands. The Dutch are world famous for how they manage water, building dikes, canals, and locks to keep the sea at bay and protect the land. It's not just one giant wall. It's a sophisticated system of layers and channels so that even if water breaches one area, the whole country doesn't flood. That's exactly like the mindset we need in financial services. You don't want a flat, open network where an intruder can move anywhere once they get in. Instead, you want segmentation, breaking down the environment into zones with checks and controls at every passage point, just like the Dutch use sluices and floodgates to control the flow of water. We can use segmentation, identity checks, and data protections to control the flow of information. And just as the Dutch protect different regions with different types of barriers, in financial services, we need to protect different systems with the right kinds of segmentation. Payment systems should be separated from customer PII, which in turn should be isolated from trading platforms. That way, if attackers breach one zone, they can't flood into everything else. The brilliance of the Dutch system is resilience. Even if one barrier fails, the others hold. And that's the same principle behind a defensible architecture in zero trust. Design it so attackers can't turn one breach into a disaster. So bringing that back to financial services as an example, think of a phishing foothold in HR that leads directly into payment processing because it's all on the same flat network. That's the sleeper agent's dream. So the sleeper agent is the name of the next villain persona. And in zero trust design, payment rails sit on their own segmented enclave so that even if phishing works, the attacker can't pivot into critical systems. So the sleeper agent excels in flat networks. Their path, compromise a vendor account or contractor credentials, escalate privileges slowly, and pivot across the network using living off the land tools until they reach settlement or payment systems. Zero trust defenses here mean segmentation, least privilege, and continuous monitoring of subtle anomalies, not just noisy alerts. So this sleeper agent here has got a patient and stealthy, opportunistic kind of personality. It's a very easy way to picture them. We've seen this exact playbook in the Target breach in 2013 via an HVAC vendor and in the Reserve Bank of New Zealand in 2021, as I mentioned earlier, through a third-party file transfer service. The architecture allowed footholds to become compromises, and zero trust segmentation and vendor access controls would have contained those. Step 3, strengthening identity, access, and endpoints. Why? Because credential theft and device compromise are consistently the top breach vectors in financial services. Adversaries know if they own an identity or endpoint, they often own the bank. So own the identity or endpoint, own the bank a lot of the time. How? Well, deploy adaptive MFA and continuous identity verification, implement just-in-time privileged access, validate device posture before every session, and apply behavioral checks for high-value transactions. The from to here is a shift from static identity controls, passwords plus a token, device checked once, and standing admin privileges, to continuous identity, device health validated every session, and privileges granted only when needed. So I might be about to disclose a little bit too much information about myself, but the image on this slide reminds me of when I was underage, trying to get into clubs with someone else's ID. Back then, if I got past the bouncer at the door, that was it. Once I was in, nobody asked questions. I could even circulate the ID back out the door so that someone else could use it. And if I went up to the bar to order a drink, nobody checked again. Not that I ever did that. Traditional identity systems in financial services often work the same way. So if you get in once with stolen credentials, a phishing link, or a compromised account, you can move freely. That's how fraudsters carry out account takeovers, or how insiders escalate privileges undetected. Once you're in, you're in. Zero Trust flips that model. It's like having staff roaming inside the club, checking IDs, and bartenders who verify every order. You don't just prove who you are once at the door, you're proving you're still you, and that you're still allowed to be where you are, doing what you're doing. In practice for financial services, this means continuous identity verification, step-up authentication for high-value actions like wire transfers and privilege monitoring, so standing admin access isn't left unchecked. The goal is simple. Even if the wrong person gets in with the wrong ID, we don't just hand them the keys to the bar. So taking this back to financial services, picture an employee falling for phishing, MFA bypassed, and an attacker escalating to domain admin with standing rights. That's the manipulator's playbook. In Zero Trust, adaptive checks flag the login, device posture fails, and admin rights aren't sitting there to be stolen. The escalation path disappears. So who is the manipulator? Again, most attacks don't start with nation-state implants, at least not today. They start with weak identity, as far as we know, which is where the manipulator thrives. And so their path is to phish a credential, bypass MFA through fatigue attacks or SIM swaps, escalate into higher privileged accounts, and initiate fraudulent transactions. They exploit gaps at the seams between cyber and fraud teams or in help desk resets. Zero Trust flips the script: phishing-resistant MFA, device posture checks, continuous risk-based session monitoring, and out-of-band verification for high-value actions. A couple of real-world parallels here: Scattered Spider, 23 and 24, used MFA fatigue to breach MGM resorts and Caesars, causing massive financial and reputational damage. And account takeover fraud has spiked across financial services globally, with billions lost annually. The manipulator is already at work. Zero Trust identity controls are the countermeasures. Step 4, securing data, applications, and third-party access. Why? Because financial services is one of the most interconnected sectors. Fintech APIs, cloud providers, and vendors all expand the attack surface. Regulators highlight third-party risk and data protection in every supervisory cycle. So how do we do it? Enforce enterprise-wide classification and encryption. Easier said than done, I know. Segment core banking apps from consumer-facing systems. Enforce least privilege on APIs with continuous monitoring. Segment and monitor vendor connections with instant revocation if needed. What's the from to here? The from is from inconsistent data tagging, contract-based vendor oversight, and broad API access. To data that's consistently tagged and encrypted, applications segmented by criticality, APIs locked down, and vendor access monitored in real time. So, for example, imagining a fintech partner with overly broad API access. When their environment is compromised, bulk data and exfiltration follows. That's the disruptor's sweet spot. In a Zero Trust model, APIs are least privilege, data is encrypted, and vendor access can be revoked instantly, stopping the disruption in its tracks. So the disruptor. I've picked like a really big guy for this. So APIs and integrations are the lifeblood of modern financial services, but they're also soft targets. The disruptor weaponizes this. Their path is probing APIs and partner connections, exploiting over-permissive scopes or misconfigurations, and causing cascading failures across critical services. They don't need to attack your core system if they can disrupt through a fintech partner. Zero Trust counters with strict API scoping, segmentation of partner lanes, encryption and classification of data, and continuous monitoring of API traffic. If you look at the MOVEit or Clio, Microsoft supply chain attacks, MFT supply chain attacks in 2023 to 2024, when third-party file transfer software was exploited to steal sensitive financial services data, or the Equifax breach in 2017, where a single unpatched web app exposed millions. The disruptor thrives on these gaps. The Zero Trust ensures partners and apps are never assumed safe. Okay, so that one's pretty straightforward, but big. Step 5 is continuous monitoring, threat intelligence, and risk-based vulnerability management. Why? Because FS adversaries adapt quickly. Patch cycles lag and logs often pile up uncorrelated. Boards and regulators now expect continuous resilience proof, not after-action reports. So this is something that we all need to focus on. How do we do it? We integrate SIM and SOAR with behavioral analytics mapped to MITRE ATT&CK. Operationalize FS ISAC feeds and the CISA KEV catalog for daily prioritization. Move from CVSS scores to exploitation-driven patching. feed monitoring results back into governance dashboards. And so the from to here, in case it wasn't clear, is the shift from quarterly patch cycles, siloed logs, and passive intel to real-time detection, daily exploitation-informed patching, and intel actively shaping defenses. Here we've shown an image of sort of a giant pothole and smaller potholes. And so you've got this giant pothole and you might, patch it first because of the CVSS score, but none of the cars are really falling into it. It's the potholes that the cars are actually driving into that are probably the ones that should be filled first. We all love potholes. Consider a VPN gateway vulnerability sitting unpatched until the next quarter. A ransomware crew exploits it today, gaining a foothold, and pivots into accounts. This is classic sleeper agent. In a zero trust approach, KV drives immediate patching, again, to where it's most relevant. Anomalies are flagged and the exploit is blocked before it spreads. So while historically financial services was patched by CVSS score, as I mentioned, patch the 10s first, the 7s later, the reality is that attackers don't care about theoretical severity. It's the ones that the cars are going to fall into or that they are falling into that need to be patched first. The opportunist scans continuously for what's exploitable now. So that's the next villain on the slide. Their path is to scan internet-facing systems, exploit KUV-listed vulnerabilities, drop commodity malware, and then monetize or sell access. Zero trust domains here means exploitation-driven patching, KUV prioritization, exposure reduction, and fast isolation playbooks. We've seen this with Citrix Bleed in 2023 to 24, where opportunists mass exploited unpatched Citrix servers in financial services firms worldwide. And with FortiGate VPN vulnerabilities in 2023 to 2024, exploited by both criminals and state actors. Zero trust maturity means patching what adversaries are actually using, not just what looks scary on paper. So onto the next slide. This 5-step roadmap gives us a structured way to look at zero trust in financial services. But remember, every institution's risk profile is different. If account takeover fraud is your #1 pain point, you might start with step 3, identity. If you're concerned about ransomware or regulatory reporting, step 1 on governance might come first. The key isn't to debate which step is, the perfect, right one to start with, but to use the structure to guide where your priorities land. I just wanted to look at a couple of use cases to show how different financial services institutions might sequence this differently, just to really hammer that home, that it isn't like a one-size-fits-all kind of strategy here. So in the next slide, we've got 2 scenarios. Scenario A is a retail bank, where identity is the front line. Fraud losses are measured daily, and account takeover is the fastest growing risk. So here, step 3 might come first. So we've got like all the steps, really just listed here, the 5 steps that I've just gone through. And I've moved step 3 up to #1 in terms of sequencing. The roadmap is the same, but the entry point shifts. Zero trust becomes a fraud reduction strategy as much as a cyber one. To contrast with scenario B, we've got an investment firm which lives or dies by reputation and uptime. For them, ransomware is existential, and here governance and defensible architecture take priority. If you can't detect, contain, and report fast, you don't stay in business. So identity still matters, but it comes a little bit later in their sequencing. And it's not like a black and white, we hit this milestone, now we start the next sequence either. As many of you probably expect, there will be some concurrency, and the key is to try to plan this out and to map this out by having the right conversations within your organization to have an honest look at really where you're at. A couple of other things that we should watch out for beyond the 5 roadmap kind of steps and the things that we mentioned today. These things that I've listed on this chart really stand out within financial services specifically. First of all, that silo between cyber and fraud teams. If they're not working the same playbook, attackers will exploit the gaps. Okay, so we've got this concrete example here of where a fraud team sees credential stuffing as a fraud issue. Cyber teams see it as an ATO/identity issue, but without collaboration, responses are fragmented. They're not seeing the same things at the same time. The negative outcome there is that attackers exploit that gap, leading to missed fraud detection or delayed IR. And then how do you fix it? The shared playbooks, as I had mentioned, and those cross-team kind of drills and that cross-team visibility. The second one here is an over-reliance on vendor trust. And this isn't just financial services. 2024 showed us, though, how, what happens when providers fail and when you haven't segmented for resilience. So the CrowdStrike outage, the Snowflake breach, the firms were impacted because they assumed vendor security is the same as their security, which it often isn't. Systemic dependency failures are the negative outcome, and continuous vendor monitoring, segmentation, and resilience planning for provider outages are really key here. And not just assuming, because it's a big company and we know we can trust them. Often that isn't the case. No one's perfect. So what is it that you can do in that case? The third one on the slide is that metrics don't reflect the real risk. Compliance reports don't stop attacks. We need to measure against what adversaries are actually doing. So, for example, reporting 95% of vulnerabilities patched within SLA, leaves the KEV listed exploits open. The negative outcome is that boards and regulators get a false sense of security. And then they're not prepared when something happens. So shifting metrics towards threat relevant outcomes like KEV patch rates, fraud loss reduction, detection to response times are good measures to consider. So consider what it is that you've got. So here they are, the villains that we've met along the way. Each one represents a real attack path that financial services is already dealing with. The extortionist, exploiting siloed governance, the sleeper agent, thriving in flat networks, the manipulator, abusing weak identity, the disruptor, turning APIs and vendor connections against us, and the opportunist, scanning for whatever we haven't patched. What makes the financial sector unique is the convergence of these threats. In other industries, you might see ransomware dominate one year or nation-state espionage the next. In financial services, they seem to all be happening at once. Fraud, ransomware, supply chain exploits, DDoS, and even global SaaS outages. And because of the sector's interconnectedness, when one institution stumbles, the ripple effect can cascade worldwide. Looking ahead, we can expect the villains to get more sophisticated, not less. Generative AI will supercharge manipulation and fraud. Nation-state campaigns will keep prepositioning in critical systems, and systemic concentration risk. Our dependence on a small set of cloud and vendor platforms means that single points of failure can become global flashpoints. I wanted to make sure that, if those weren't enough, we've also thought about new villains that are already emerging. Here on this slide, you see that I haven't chosen persona images for them yet, but the AI-enhanced manipulator will supercharge fraud and phishing with deepfakes and scams as a service, and that's something that I'm sure you're thinking about and feeling. The quantum opportunist is waiting in the wings, harvesting encrypted data today to crack down when quantum computing matures. And supply chain phantom reminds us that even trusted vendors can become the weakest link, as we saw with Snowflake and CrowdStrike in 2024. That's the trajectory we're on, which is why it's so important that we don't stop at awareness. Although awareness is critical, we also need a plan of action. So let's turn to a few things that you can do next. It's the hero slide. So you've met the villains, and now we've walked through 5 roadmap steps that counted them. In addition to the roadmap building blocks, I wanted to give you some next steps you can take back to your teams to begin their journey starting tomorrow, so that you guys can continue to be the heroes or position yourselves to be the heroes of tomorrow. First, assess your posture honestly. Where are you today across the 10 zero trust domains? What's mature? What's ad hoc? And what's not started? That baseline matters more than picking a fancy framework. Don't grade yourself on compliance checklists alone. Use frameworks like NIST CSF2, FFI ECCAT, and OSFI E13. Second, prioritize by threat relevance. The steps of the roadmap aren't arbitrary. They align directly with the most common attack paths we've seen in financial services. If ransomware or DDoS are your top concerns, start with governance and segmentation. If fraud and account takeover are frontline issues, strengthen identity first. You can pick a high-value use case to start with too. Payments, customer onboarding, or third-party connections, for example. Third, sequence action. Zero trust isn't a big bang, it's iterative. Start with 1 or 2 quick wins that close obvious gaps, that are gaps that everyone understands. Enforce phishing-resistant MFA, implement segmentation around crown jewel systems, or shift to KEV-driven patching. Build credibility with early progress and then expand. And that's not that you don't work on things that people don't understand yet, but get them to understand it. Fourth, connect teams. Cyber, fraud, operations, risk, compliance, they all face the same villains. Zero trust only works if these groups share playbooks, telemetry, and governance, not just based on who they're reporting to. Break the silos. And finally, speaking of who they report to, engage leadership. Regulators in the US, EU, and Canada are already moving zero trust into policy. Boards and executives are listening. Bring them the story, but also the plan. Make zero trust the framework that ties resilience to business outcomes. If there's one thing to take away from today, it's this. We know that zero trust isn't a product, and it isn't a slogan. It's a mindset, a sequence, and a set of actions that, taken step by step, make the villains' playbooks harder, slower, and less profitable. And that's how resilience will be built. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation today. I would love to hear from you. I would love to have some more conversations with you on how to build zero trust and resilience within your organization. And I would love it if you subscribe to my podcast at Wired for Change. Please reach out to me. And that's it for today.
Thanks so much, Amy. Great job. Honestly, I love the slides. You have great enthusiasm when you're presenting the stuff. It just makes me want to listen to the whole thing. So well done. We kind of took a lot of time on this one. I had some questions. I was actually crossing them off as you kept going because you were answering them along the way.
Okay, then I'm done.
Right, you did great. The only question I didn't cross off, and I kind of already feel like you already have an answer for it, but it's like, the people that say, like, we've always done this stuff and it works just fine the way it's been, and we haven't been breached yet, is how do you get past that roadblock, I would say? Because that feels like that's probably like the biggest roadblock people run into with this architecture, is that just getting past what we've always done.
I think that usually the people who say that don't have the monitoring in place to know whether or not they've ever been breached before. So it's very hard for those people to even know whether or not they've been breached in the past, because they probably don't have the systems and processes to monitor that. And it is something that I come across, very frequently. And I think that until they have their first incident, most organizations think that way. I think it's unarguable that the landscape is changing. I think that deriving things from, existing challenges that, we know that we have that are systemic. Do we have this challenge, and this challenge in terms of those challenges that I mentioned, at the beginning? Usually the answer is yes. I would say, first start monitoring to see whether or not anyone is on the system, because usually there has been some kind of a breach and they just didn't know about it. And then monitor moving forward. I think one of the important things also to remember is that it's not a blame game. I think one of the fears that people have when they look at this is, even if I have been breached in the past, maybe somebody will think that it's because I wasn't doing my job properly, for example. And we need to create a good environment for having those conversations and to be able to be honest. Maybe we haven't detected anything previously, but maybe it's because we didn't have the systems in place to monitor. Regardless of that, it's got to be about moving forward. Even organizations with, tons of defenses and a lot of things, already set in place, and the processes that they need get breached all the time. So I think that that past argument isn't going to work necessarily moving forward either.
Right. We really do have to get away from the blame stuff, because it reminds me of a Star Trek episode where Picard is talking to Data, and he's like, Data's really puzzled about something, and he's like, and Picard basically just tells him, you can do everything right and still lose. So it's not that anybody in financial services is doing a terrible job. The blame is the bad guys are evil and creeps. Honestly, that is really where the blame goes. There's thieves in the world, and that really is what needs to be dealt with. But
Absolutely. And even with the monitoring systems in place, as we know, they the living off the land and the sleeper agent, they hide. They hide, and they look like everybody else. And the key is to, what steps do we need moving forward, and how do we get prepared to, continue to function when things go down as well, and manage through operations. So yeah, absolutely. Great point, Tom. Thanks for bringing up Star Trek too. I love being nerdy with you.
I know. I figured. I thought you'd get the reference. So, You are a cyber hero. Everybody out here watching today is actually, frankly, a cyber hero to me. You chose to get more education today, and you came to the virtual conference. You guys are heroes. You guys are trying to do this hard, daunting task, and I appreciate and salute all of you. So thank you all. Thank you, Amy Yee. We're going to see her again in December. Different topic, though. I'm not going to spoil this one. You'll have to sign up for our December 4th East Coast. It's actually east of the anybody can attend, frankly. Sign up. We've got messages going out, but December 4th is our East virtual conference. We'll see her again then. Check her out on LinkedIn. Connect. She wants to talk to you about zero trust and how to fix your stuff. That, to me, collaboration is our only silver bullet. That is what we have. Check out Wired for Change while you take a break. We've got a break coming up. Go check that out on YouTube, and then we've got more sessions on the way. So thanks again, Amy. We'll see everybody at the next round of sessions.
Thank you, everyone. All the best.